Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. It is our 13th post-game edition of this podcast in 2024, but certainly a different variety of the show as we come off of a Big Ten championship game appearance for Penn State, their first in 8 years. And boy, were there a lot of points put up in Indianapolis tonight. I'm Tyler Donahue. He is Daniel Gallen. I'm coming to you from our Happy Valley headquarters. Daniel is still situated at Lucas Oil Stadium. It's about 1:30 a.m. We're in store for a night of coverage and content at Lions247.com. If you're one of the nocturnal creatures joining us late on Saturday night, thank you for making us a part of your experience. If you're picking up this on Sunday morning into Sunday afternoon, it's a whole new ball game. Penn State did not get the Big Ten championship. Oregon prevailed 45-37. Certainly looked like the number one team in the country in a lot of different aspects. And we'll talk about how Penn State comes out of this matchup. But Daniel, they fall to 11-2. The dream of securing a bye week and perhaps the number one seed in the tournament, that probably would have been the case since Texas lost to Georgia in the SEC title game. Those are dashed. But as James Franklin referenced in his opening statement during the postgame, they expect to learn some solid news from the playoff committee on Sunday, likely sending them back to Beaver Stadium on either December 20th or the 21st for a home first-round playoff matchup. They would make their playoff debut. But before we get to that and what comes next, we got so much to work our way through. A matchup where we saw 82 points put up combined.
Yeah, before we started recording, you said that the updates were coming fast and furious on your in-game post, and yeah, it's the type of thing where I'm going through the box score after I got up from post-game media, and you see things, and you're like, "Wait, do I remember that happening? Did that happen?" It was just a very wild game, and I think that you look at how Penn State played, and it was just a very unique way that they went about it. I thought at one point that they might be done when they go down by 18 points. Like it looked like, oh, this is going to get bad. This is going to get out of hand. But they found their footing. They made it a game. It was an 8-point game late. They got the ball back with 2:08 left and a chance to tie. Drew Aller throws and very unfortunate interception. I guess all interceptions are unfortunate. But Penn State had a chance, and 2 hours earlier, didn't really feel like that was going to be the case.
They were trailing 28-10 in the second quarter. Oregon had scored 4 touchdowns on 5 possessions, and I also recalled that back in 2016 in that same stadium, Penn State, before they won the Big Ten championship, they were down 28-7 in the second quarter against Wisconsin. And you had the sense, hey, maybe they could find something here. And they did. This offense ended up putting together a ton of production over the course of the matchup, 500 plus yards on the game, almost 300 of them on the ground. They lost their turnover battle 2-0. A lot of that goes on Drew Aller's shoulders. Dylan Gabriel on the other end, Oregon's quarterback, as we discussed throughout our week of podcast here leading into the matchup, thought he might be sensational leading that offense. He largely was, 22 of 32, 283 yards, 4 touchdowns through the air, big plays over the course of this matchup, fourth down throw to help seal this victory, and a big run at the end to really put it on ice. But before we get to the particulars here and work our way through them, I think there's 2 elephants in the room we should probably address, Daniel. One, 45 points allowed. That's the most points surrendered by Penn State since the Rose Bowl in January of 2017, after the game after that game against Wisconsin that we just referenced. And then the other elephant in the room, the officiating. We don't tend to talk about that here on the postgame podcast. It's not really something we dwell on. I think it's it often can be a loser's response to tight games and narrow matchups, but it was repeatedly an issue, it felt like, over the course of this game, and repeatedly an issue for particularly Penn State, whether it was some replay discussions, whether it was lack of holding penalties. We're going to talk about some Penn State play calls that were within their control, but wherever you want to take it, whether it's Penn State's defense getting gashed or James Franklin feeling like, yeah, there were some things missing along the way here from our relationship with the officials. You tell me where you want to start, because you just spoke to Franklin. You just heard from a bunch of players. I want to check your pulse there in Indianapolis.
Yeah, we can talk about the officiating just to get it out of the way. Like you said, I have a similar view on it. Like, I don't like to get hung up on it because there's a lot more that goes into a game. There's a lot of different reasons why you win or lose, and part of it is that, and also at this point in the year, I'm kind of like what you're going to get, and so it doesn't surprise me that things aren't being called, stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, today it got to the point where you're watching Abdul Carter, getting a bear hug, trying to get away from a tackle, and being put in some, I think, unusual physical positions, and it stood out. James Franklin, unprompted, in the answer to a different question that was not about officiating, mentioned that there were no holding calls in the game, and he said it's going to be interesting to watch back. But his real hang up was the Omari Evans play, where Evans caught a pass, it was ruled incomplete, and then there was no challenge. It did not get buzzed down to review. There were a couple different points over the course of the game where they did the expedited review, where the referee doesn't have to go under the hood. It comes down from up top that, hey, we need to change this. Let's do it right now.
We need more expedited reviews. I'm just going to go on the record. More of those, please.
Yeah, same. And so that's where it kind of, so that's where Franklin that was really, I think, what was getting to him. And yeah, he's right. Like, that's a thing where, if you're not calling holding, I'm kind of like, fine. That's that's how they're going to do it. You just roll with it. You can be mad about it. You can be upset about it. I personally thought it impacted the viewing experience a little bit of this game. But that Omari Evans play, I think that's like an actual failure by the officiating. That's like a protocol type thing. And Franklin was like, yeah, like, people are saying, you should have challenged it. You should have used the timeout. He's like, it's a 2-minute drill. We're trying to keep things moving. We're trying to accomplish a goal. You don't really have time to wait around to be like, are you guys going to take a look at this? Are you not? That sort of thing. And, it just really stood out to me as a very, very big mistake. And, it's like it's also your most visible game of the year. You're in this 8 p.m. time slot, national television. You have the number one team in the country that's undefeated. Like, there's going to be a lot of interest in that. And to not, come through as an official and get stuff wrong like that, I think it's a tough look, I think, for the Big Ten. So we'll see once we get into a college football playoff and maybe the assignments are a little bit different. We'll see how things are going to be called. But that really stood out. And I'll use that as just like a quick jumping off point to talk about Abdul Carter because he was, I think, the victim in a lot of these cases. We've seen him lobbying officials after plays and, talking with the referee in the backfield and stuff like that. But he, and he's talked about that. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to get discouraged. I just have to control what I can control. And the way that he was playing tonight, it didn't look like a player who was, letting that get to him. We saw him flying around, made some good plays out in the flat, made some plays in pursuit. I thought he was just really, really solid on a night when that defense didn't really have too much to hang its hat on.
Yeah, he made a huge play later in the game to prevent Oregon from scoring another touchdown, held them to a field goal at one spot where he was able to break on the ball carrier with quick notice. But there was also a play where he essentially broke a tackle to make a tackle, and no flag was thrown. That's kind of been the deal with Abdul Carter all year long. I know people on our message board are convinced he would have 30 sacks if they were calling the game fairly, but it goes beyond those things, and it'll be something that's scrutinized, certainly, and I think it'll probably come up with James Franklin again, or at least we'll attempt to do that as a media beat early on whenever we get a chance to speak with him coming out of this matchup again. But at the end of the day, we have to break down the fact that this defense didn't really have a solution. It didn't have one early, and that was very apparent as Oregon just scored and scored and scored. They got the 31 points at halftime, and that was more points than Penn State had given up in a full game all season long. And you had to actually go back a couple years the last time they gave up that many points. As I said, at the end of the day, 45 is the most points Penn State has surrendered since they took on USC in that memorable January 2017 Rose Bowl matchup. But Daniel, just when you go through what Dylan Gabriel and this offense were able to do, 9 plays, 84 yards to start the game, touchdown. 10 plays, 75 yards on their next drive, touchdown. 7 plays, 60 yards on the next possession, touchdown. They got a punt. And then on the very next possession, very easy for them. They're giving the ball on the doorstep after Drew Aller's first interception in the game, and they punch that in, and that puts them up 28-10. And we had seen some flashes early, Drew Aller's interception aside, where you thought, okay, the offense came to play today. Tyler Warren was involved early, like he was not against Ohio State. So that was a good sign of forward progress. And then Nick Singleton was exactly as we had seen him at the end of the regular season, looking like the field stretcher. We didn't get to Katron Allen until later, but boy, did he show up in a big way. But again, the story of this game was the offense really came to play. Andy Kotelnicki, you look back at the Ohio State game, they didn't score a single touchdown. They scored more points today on this Oregon team, and I think we all have a lot of respect for what they've accrued there in Eugene. They hadn't given up this many points in a game for Oregon since November of 2022 with a different coaching staff, not a different coaching staff, but against Oregon State before this coaching staff had really made its major impact and its imprint. So Penn State had as much success against Oregon in the Dan Lanning era as really anybody, and yet because of the defensive struggles, it felt like they were playing with very slim margin for error, and thus 2 interceptions that can doom you.
Yeah, I think the Penn State defense, looking at how they performed tonight, I mean, I was surprised that they got gashed like this, and it made for an interesting game flow. Where I know earlier this year we talked about Penn State hadn't won a lot of close games in the past couple of years after that Bowling Green game. I mean, Penn State hasn't really been in a lot of shootouts recently. I think at least like in my time on the beat, like it's either they score a bunch of points, or there was the one Michigan game 2 years ago where Michigan scored a lot of points. Like there haven't really been back and forths like this in a while, and that really stood out to me. But I think the one thing, and James Franklin said this post game, is that like the defense struggled, but at the same time you look at that Oregon offense and the talent that they have. Dylan Gabriel, really good. He might be in New York next weekend for the Heisman ceremony.
He needs to be. He needs to be there. I mean, they have been the wire-to-wire team. They've been the elite team in college football. They showed that again today in a lot of ways. I know people want to point to some things Penn State didn't do, some miscues. Oregon put them on pressure from the first snap of this game. That they showed with their prowess. And Gabriel was the point guard. We talked about it leading up. It's not about deep shots. It's about orchestrating this thing, getting the ball in space, working laterally, and he had the answer every single time. Even when he had guys barreling down on him, I think it was Kobe King almost hit him on that 4th down throw where Oregon ends up being able to extend things late versus Penn State maybe getting a chance to go down the field and continue momentum. He just had the answers, and I know I kind of pounced on that, but I think we have to acknowledge this guy showed up in the bright lights. He's done it for other programs. He killed it for UCF. He killed it for Oklahoma. Statistically, individually, he has a championship pedigree program around him right now, and he lived up to the moment today, and I think we have to acknowledge that as well.
Definitely. And then you get to who he was throwing to. You think about that Ole Miss game in the Peach Bowl last year, and coming out of that big narrative was, look at what the Penn State wide receivers did, look at what Ole Miss's pass catchers did, and it really highlighted the weakness of that. I think tonight also did a similar exercise. I know that I think at one point pretty late in the game, the Penn State wide receivers only had 2 catches for 38 yards. And then you look across the field at what Tez Johnson is doing, and just how dominant he was. Every time he got the ball in his hands, he made somebody miss. He broke a tackle. He was able to get open really well. Like there was one play where I think it was a 3rd down conversion where he's lined up in the slot. Zion Tracy is across from him. He gets to the top of his route, and Tracy is on him. Tracy tried to be physical with him at the top of the route, but Johnson just cuts to the middle and immediately gets that separation. And it's easy pitch and catch. I think he probably got a couple yards after the catch too. Like that is a very, very good receiver out there. And it was, really, really fun to watch, what he was able to do. And I think you saw some things like tackling issues pop up in the secondary. He took advantage of that. He was just able to get open really well. It was tough, for this Penn State defense. To their credit, they did get a couple stops in the second half. They got Penn State the ball back, for that last drive. They did give them a chance there at the end. But if your defense is playing like that as an offense, you have to play that complementary football, and you can't gift the other team a short field, the shortest field possible. Like, you can't squander your opportunities, especially when it was clear early on what kind of game this was going to be.
Yeah, and we saw, by the way, you're right, that defense did come up, and it wasn't Ohio State part 2 where you need a stop, you're down by a possession, and the defense can't get you back on the field. In this case, it was 3 and out for Oregon. Yes, they had scored 45 points at that stage, but there's 2 minutes left. It's an 8-point deficit, and your defense is getting you the ball back. And what do? The very first play of that possession, Nick Singleton, 9 yards on the ground. Again, they're approaching 300 yards on the ground. Frustratingly, though, 2nd and 1, interception. Drew Aller tries to target Harrison Wallace deep on a 50-50 ball. We'll get to that and that play call and what Drew Aller said about it in a moment, Daniel. But you mentioned Tez Johnson. I mean, he missed much of November with an injury. We knew he was going to be a factor. But for him to go 11 catches in this game, the question I have for you, he goes 11 catches, 181 yards, 1 touchdown. Nobody else on the Oregon roster has more than 3 catches. Nobody else on the Oregon roster has more than 30 receiving yards. Is it all that different than what Penn State's stat sheet may have looked like if Tyler Warren catches a couple passes that either A, he couldn't corral, which was kind of uncharacteristic, but 2, there was a miss or 2 from Drew Aller over the course of the night where you can probably pour on maybe 40+ yards to Tyler Warren's stat sheet, maybe a touchdown on one of those throws where it's just not where it needs to be, and Tyler Warren gets a few shots at it and fights it all the way to the ground but can't pull it in. He finished with 7 catches for 84 yards. He was involved. Harrison Wallace was more involved late. He gets to the end zone, 4 catches, 59 yards. You saw Omari Evans pop up again. He's had a nice little run here lately with a 22-yard catch. But I guess my point is it's hard to really say the offense failed you in any way because maybe you can't point to a gaudy number for receivers. But again, if Warren's able to connect on a couple of those plays with Drew Aller, which didn't happen, does the stat sheet overall look all that different than what Dylan Gabriel and Tez Johnson in Oregon put together? Because Drew Aller's 226 passing yards, 3 touchdowns through the air, 1 touchdown rushing, but those 2 interceptions costed his completion percentage down more than we're accustomed to, right around 50%. But I think ultimately, again, it's hard to say other than a play here, a decision there, that this offense is the reason Penn State got in a plane in Indianapolis tonight and came home without a trophy.
Yeah, I think you look at those drops by Warren. I mean, it was just very, very uncharacteristic of him. I think usually we see him come down with those big catches, and that probably changes the complexion of things a little bit. I did feel like Drew Aller was maybe a little tentative at times. There are the moments where you feel like if he just goes back and just rips it right away, that they could make a play, but then he'll, maybe hesitate for a second. Then it's okay, I'm going to extend the play. I'm looking downfield and then throwing it away or forcing it or checking down or something. I thought there were a couple times where there were downfield passes that he could have attempted and ultimately didn't. But I think that as a whole, when you look at the offense's performance like holistically, you're kind of like, okay, like this was a good night. I mean, they put up 518 yards on a defense that had been very, very solid. But I think when you look at it within, the context of the game and the slow start in the first quarter where you get down 28-10, I think that's where I think you can poke some more holes in the offense and be a little bit more critical.
Yeah, well, Aller was able to bounce back from that interception that put Oregon up 28-10 on the ensuing play, a 1-yard touchdown run. Back-to-back touchdown drive for the Nittany Lions. They were able to force a punt along the way, make it a 28-24 game. Late in the second quarter, that was Aller throwing the ball deep to Omari Evans for that 22-yard score. That was also a touchdown for Aller himself, showing some physicality, getting in from 7 yards out. Oregon's able to get a kick toward the end of the half to make it a 31-24 game. And Penn State comes out in the second half, Daniel. They go 52 yards on 11 plays, and they get in a situation where it's, okay, maybe on the edge of field goal position. You're definitely within range for Ryan Barker, but you're also in a spot where you're down by 7 against Oregon. They put up 31 points on you in the first half, and you haven't faced them yet in the second half. And I know this was brought up in the post-game press conference. Barker ultimately goes out there. He misses wide right. He's been really consistent for them for the most part since taking over this job, but it just felt like from that moment on, and of course we know Oregon then marched down the field, and that's when Tez Johnson shows up with a 48-yard touchdown. All of a sudden, it's 38-24. It's a big hole again. Is this game getting away? But can you kind of take us back to that decision to try out the field goal team versus maybe getting aggressive with the offense and trying to tie the game up there with that opening possession of the third quarter?
Yeah, James Franklin said that in terms of their sequencing and what they were talking about on the headsets, that if they had gotten it to 4th and 3 or fewer, they would have gone for it. But instead, where they were at 4th and 5, they elected to kick the field goal. And I do think that, I felt in the moment I could have seen them going for it. But at the same time, the way that things have been going, I was like, you need any points that you can get. I know that 7 is more than 3 and much more important. But right there, I think that especially coming out of the half and, having fought your way back into it over the course of the second quarter, I looked at it and I thought, okay, like if you get 3 here, you make it a 4-point game. That might change the math a little bit further, further along, which we can also talk about. I was like, okay, I could see doing this. Personally, I thought that this was a game where it's like, go for it. Just you got to throw it all. Throw the kitchen sink at it and see what you can do, especially the way the game had been going. But yeah, that was Franklin's explanation. I think your mileage may vary on it, as with most of these explanations, but I thought it made sense from what Franklin had said.
Okay, so you're down 38-24 at that point, and you're thinking this one again. Penn State rallied, but that rally's over. Oregon's taking control, and then all of a sudden, Katron Allen entered the chat and looked about as good as we've ever seen him in a Penn State uniform. And maybe he's been listening to the podcast because we've been spending time wondering if they need to put more eggs in the basket of Nick Singleton, and I think he validated that early. He had a 40-yard run on the first possession, did Singleton, and he kept making big plays over the course of this game. And this was really probably, you could make the case this was the best game these two have played together. I'll have to go back and look at some of the things they've done. I know they had some big moments in the last couple of years, but this was a special night. And Katron Allen in particular took over on the ensuing drive. He ultimately scored a touchdown to make it a 38-30 game. And we'll talk about what Singleton and Allen did individually, but we're now to another pivot point in this matchup, 38-30. And Daniel, they decide to keep the offense on the field, go for 2. And look, you see this kind of thing play out everywhere in the NFL now, across college football, 8-point deficit, try to make it a 6-point game. It's not that radical to see at this stage of college football, but it's going to have scrutiny on it because it didn't work. And Penn State ultimately lost by 8. And so what do you make of that decision? And what do you make of the feedback that James Franklin provided regarding it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the right call. Like you want to win the game in regulation. That's what Franklin said. And the way that Oregon had been playing, you didn't want to go to overtime. Like you needed to win the game, not go to penalty kicks with the 2-point conversions, anything like that. And so that's what Franklin was setting up. And you go for 2 after that first one, and that gives you the information you need to know for the second one. Okay, do we need, because you're gonna have to make it, if you want to win, you're gonna have to make a 2-point conversion, or if you want to keep the game going. So I'm fine with it. I tweeted out an explanation that one of my old colleagues, Sheil Kapadia at the Ringer, that I reached out to him last year because he's a little bit more immersed in this, and he laid it out nicely with the 3 scenarios and things, and you give yourself a better chance to win. Like that's what this all comes down to. James Franklin in a winner-take-all game, like he's not playing for a tie in a game where you've struggled and you've had to fight to even get to that point to get within a score. Like you want to be there, you want to end it. I honestly, part of me after they scored to make it 28-24, there was part of me on that touchdown where I was like, they should maybe go for it here to get to 28-25, because the margins were so thin. Oregon was moving the ball well, and you needed to do anything you could to get a win. So I know that it's a very polarizing decision, and it's definitely one where when it doesn't work, it's easy to criticize. But I think that was the right call by Franklin there to be that aggressive and to go after it in that manner.
If you think it's polarizing now, imagine if they lost by 2 points. That would have been really a conversation. But ultimately, at that stage, 38-30. And again, you just can't come up with the answer. Oregon regains control, 12 plays, 75-yard drive that takes about 7 minutes off the clock. Essentially, the first half of the fourth quarter dwindles down as Dylan Gabriel marches them down. This is when you see that key fourth down completion to Terrence Ferguson, leads to a touchdown run for Jordan James, and it's 45-30. And again, you're like, okay, well, that's the end of the rally for Penn State. Again, they had a third one in them, though, Daniel. They're still battling. Drew Aller ends up throwing that 14-yard touchdown to Harrison Wallace on a 4th and 10. He's got a defender hanging on his jersey, grabbing him, and Aller shows that power, throws the ball. Harrison Wallace gets to the end zone. That makes it a 45-37 game. We talked about how Penn State gets a chance later in this matchup. But man, I think we just got a note here. Every time it felt like Oregon had maybe landed a fatal blow and it was time for Penn State to kind of maybe curl in that fetal position. And let's be honest, we saw them do it last year against Ohio State. We saw them do it last year against Michigan. We saw them do it last December against Ole Miss, where they just took the kicks and eventually they were down. They never got down and they kept battling. And say what you will, they put themselves in a position with 2 minutes left in the Big Ten championship game to tie the game for the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff tournament.
Yeah, the fact that Penn State even put itself in that position was amazing to see. I think that, while there's still a ways for this program to go, when you talk about their standing nationally, I think that this shows progress from last year, from the past couple of years, where, in 2022, they're on the road at Michigan and it just gets away from them. That game against Ohio State later that year, that also got away from them late. But then you look at how they handled today, and it really would have been easy for them to, curl up in a ball, say, well, we're going to get that home playoff game probably. Like, we still have more season left. What happens here? Sure. But they didn't, and they had that chance to tie. I think that I was honestly surprised that they got back to that point. Given what I just laid out, I probably shouldn't have been, given what we know about this team and what we know about Drew Aller and some of the other leaders on it. But I think the fact that you push the number 1 team in the country, the number 1 undefeated overall top seed in the college football playoff, I mean, you push them to the brink, and they're a team that, after their slow start to the season, they had not been pushed to the brink very often. I mean, it's not a moral victory because those don't exist, but I think it's a notable data point with this Penn State program under James Franklin and how they react to adversity, how they're handling different things that they come across over the course of a season.
And this was a game, look, we talked about missing a field goal. We discussed some of the officiating that maybe didn't work out in the Nittany Lions' favor, and the turnovers being against them. And there was just a lot that was seemingly working against them in this matchup for them to have that football in that spot. And let's go to how this game ended ultimately for the Nittany Lions. They have a situation where they start out that last possession with a nice play, a 9-yard gain from Nick Singleton. It felt like every time they went to the ground, they were getting something good off of it, which is really impressive, I think, against this Oregon defense. And then ultimately, though, 2nd and 1, you got timeouts. You've got time, more than I think 2 minutes or so on the clock. And Drew Aller takes a shot down the right side of the field. Nico Reed makes a nice play on the ball. Harrison Wallace tried to make a play on the ball. He was kind of like a defender trying to knock that ball down, but Aller is intercepted. Oregon puts the game away a few plays later, and that's all she wrote. So I know that was a big topic of discussion in post-game too for you out in Indianapolis, Daniel. That decision, what Drew Aller saw on the read, and why it went that way.
Yeah, Aller took responsibility for it. He said that he needs to do a better job making that a ball, either Trey Wallace or nobody, that he didn't quite get it close enough to the sideline over there. But I thought Nico Reed made a really, really nice play on that. It was one of the things where the way that he came up with it, like when he went to the ground, I was very surprised that he was able to catch that. So I think that it's a tough way to end the game, and I think that I'm okay with taking a shot there. Like, you're coming out of the 2-minute warning. It's 2nd and 1. You've been running the ball well, so if you don't hit, then you'll probably convert, pick it up, keep things moving. I do think that if you hit on that big play to Wallace, and with the amount of time that was left, it gives you a chance to manage things, to put yourself in a position to tie the game, and run some clock too, and put Oregon in a tough position and get things to overtime. I think that I talked about it earlier, and where I thought there were moments where Drew Aller could have been more aggressive, and wasn't. So I feel like I'd be a little hypocritical if I dinged him there. But it was a thing where I'm fine with it. Like, 2nd and 1, take a shot, and you can't be too conservative. You can't be scared in this type of situation. And I think up to that point, Aller had, I think, found his footing a little bit more, with things after the early interception and the early slow start. So I think it was just it's one of those things where maybe Aller could have played it a little bit differently, but it was just also a great play by the defender.
I think on Monday when you and Mark join me again for our follow-up podcast to this one, we put some pieces together, picking up on maybe what you learned from Drew Aller, about Drew Aller after this matchup, his demeanor a little bit, because again, we're putting those pieces together on who he is as a quarterback. And again, 2nd-year starter today versus a 6th-year starter at Oregon. And you could see the separation. Was Dillian Gabriel the kind of prototypical quarterback that Aller was coming out of high school? No, but he was also considered a blue chip quarterback recruit, big time quarterback recruit, but not the number one quarterback recruit. But he's seen a lot of live bullets. He's lost a lot of close games. He's played for different coaches, different coordinators, different programs. And he's to this point in his journey. You just wonder, Drew Aller, if he were to go for it again next year and took another step, how might he look if he got another shot in a game like this as a senior, as a 3rd-year starter? That's something that we'll table for a few weeks down the road. But Daniel, I think we got to finish our focus here on the offensive backfield elsewhere, because if they're going to be able to move the ball like this in the ground with those two guys, I think they can really hang with or potentially beat anybody in the playoff field, because look, 229 rushing yards on 24 carries between Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. They both were over 100 rushing yards. They both were involved in the passing game. Nick Singleton, 22-yard touchdown catch. He had 43 yards on 4 catches. Katron Allen had 3 catches in this game as well, a little more modest with 15 yards. But Allen averaged 9 yards per carry. Singleton averaged 10.5 yards per carry. Singleton had a 41-yard run. Katron Allen had a 32-yard run. They were doing things together that we simply haven't seen them do together very often. We saw Nick Singleton hot early in the season. We've seen Katron Allen have some moments, but largely kind of a slog for him in Big Ten play. If this is a sample size of what postseason play is going to look like for the offense, again, they're going to be able to hang with teams. And if Drew Aller can protect the ball, make some plays down the field, they can beat, I think, anybody on the field if they're playing their best. The other thing is here, Andy Kotelnicki is going to continue to get phone calls as a potential coaching candidate because, again, you're putting points up like this on the board. You're doing it in a variety of ways. And if you can sustain this for a home playoff game, then to a neutral field perhaps, I mean, that's where the question goes now, Daniel. What do we think about the ceiling of this team? Because in my mind, coming off of this particular loss in Indianapolis versus 5 weeks ago, coming out of yet another loss to Ohio State where they failed to score a touchdown, where they failed to get the Buckeyes off the field with 5 minutes to play, I view the Nittany Lions overall 2024 ceiling. We're getting late in 2024. I think it's a little bit higher than where I would have figured it was forecasted at 5 weeks ago. Do you agree with me? Are you going to push against that? Where do you stand coming out of this one?
Yeah, I think coming out of this one, it just kind of solidified my thoughts on where Penn State stands nationally. And I think that they're in that tier 1B, and it's where they might be the only team in it, where they're definitely not the number 1 team in the country. I think that they come in with that number 3 ranking. And honestly, that's probably a little high. I think that the rankings, there's certain things out of your control on how you end up there. But they bump up against this ceiling, and we've seen it before against Ohio State, against Michigan. They're very good, they're great, and they're just not quite elite to bring it back to that theme. And so that solidified it. I mean, I do think that maybe the team that we saw tonight, I can see them potentially winning 2 games in the playoff, depending on their draw. Like, it would not surprise me to see them make a run based off of what we saw tonight and what we've seen over the course of the season. But when you get into that, if you were to get to that semifinal round, or things were to break in a certain way where you get a team out of the SEC, or you have to see Oregon or Ohio State again, then I think things could be a little dicey. But I think coming out of it, like, I feel good about this team and everything. It's just you saw an elite program like Oregon not make mistakes in key moments, and how that helped them. I do think Katron.
Sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was gonna bring it back to Katron Allen too.
Yeah.
I think having him going, that definitely changes the complexion of the offense, and it's something that we've talked about, where these 2 backs play off of each other really well. And Allen finished with 8.9 yards per carry, and his last carry was a 1-yard touchdown run, so that bumped it down. But like, the past 5 games, 2.6, 1.4, 3.3, 4.9, 2.3. Like, it was not pretty when he had the ball. And to see him get out in space, make guys miss, it was just really impressive. And I think maybe the most surprising thing that happened for Penn State tonight, that was a very, I think, compelling development to get out of things.
It may have been the most complete offensive performance in some ways that we've seen this year, but it also was clearly the worst defensive performance that we've seen against this Oregon team, which is, as James Franklin said 3 times in his opening statement, the number 1 ranked team in the country. He also said he thinks these 2 losses to top 5 teams have them ready to learn and become a better program. He phrased it as, this season has just begun, as his locker room message. So we'll learn about Penn State's draw on Sunday. Did they do enough here against Oregon, a 1-possession defeat ultimately, to avoid falling below the Ohio State Buckeyes? Did they do enough to win an edge over the Texas Longhorns, or did they land behind them? You're looking 5-6 range for Penn State, home playoff game. We'll see what the committee announces on Sunday. We'll have full coverage at Lions247.com. Mark and Daniel are going to actually stay in Indianapolis on Sunday to make sure they don't miss a part of the action. But Daniel, we'll pick up the pieces again early in the week, and we'll start to figure out what's next for Penn State. We do know it's not going to be a game week upcoming. It's going to be a 1 week off for this team, and then back at it, and 1 week off for us from the weekend. So appreciate you and Mark for getting it done. Look forward to your coverage into the night, into Sunday, and we'll talk to you real soon. But for now, I guess we're ready to step aside, and we got to cover a Big Ten championship game, Daniel, this year. I think 5 weeks ago, especially, we didn't think that was in the cards, and so you got to see quite the action in Indy tonight.
Definitely. It's been a season with some twists and turns, and I think this was the biggest twist of them all, and there's still potential for some more as we move forward.
Stay with our coverage at Lions247.com. For now, stepping aside on behalf of Daniel, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.